Coming up on today's episode, we talk about why a landlord exodus might not really be happening, the risks of e-bikes in rental properties, and why the Labour government needs to start showing some common sense when it comes to the private rental sector, with our special guest, property expert, Julie Ford. Thank you so much for joining us today, Julie. It's really great to have you on and get all your expertise about everything going on in the private rented sector at the moment. As we know, there's a lot to unpack and unravel, so it's really great to have your expertise. But before we get started talking about that, I'd really like to start with yourself, if I may. So you've worked in the property industry for more than 30 years. I mean, you've worked as a letting agent and a housing law caseworker, I believe. So it would be really nice to hear from yourself. How did your property journey start? Have you always been interested in property at a young age, or did you kind of fall into it? How did it all start?
Yeah, it really was a by accident, to be honest with you. When I was at school, all I wanted to be when I grew up was a policeman. That's all I wanted to do.
Really?
I went to uni and did law because I then wanted to become a criminal barrister when I grew up. None of that actually came to fruition. I married a soldier. When I was 18. So we travelled around quite a lot. So being transient, it doesn't allow you to study law and do the things that you really want to do. So I started getting part-time jobs, and I actually started as a new build sales girl with a block in Fry and Barnet in North London, selling phases of these new luxury apartments. And I very quickly learned I can't sell to anybody that doesn't want to buy. But when people had purchased and then came down with snagging issues, like the tile had fallen off or the mastic round the bath wasn't working properly, oh my goodness, I was in my element. I could fix that. I found a plumber, I found a handyman and solved it immediately. So I realized I was a fixer. That's my trade. I fix things. I'm a problem solver. And from that point onwards, I moved into property management because really that's all you do on a daily basis. You solve the landlord's problem, the tenant's problem, your manager's problem. You're solving everybody's problem. And that's where I really found my niche. And I still had the love of law there as well. So really got stuck into housing law, and kind of the rest is history, really. I then moved into third sector working for the Citizens Advice. I worked for a local homeless charity as well, as a relocation agent for them. So finding properties from landlords that we could then move people from street homeless into the accommodation while we supported them for 2 years to then be able to move on to their own settled accommodation. And now I work as a consultant in the industry and a trainer for a number of the organisations out there. So that's kind of how my journey went. It was more organic than certainly not planned.
That's amazing to hear how your journey got started all the way to now. That's amazing how you were saying there at the beginning about you wanted to be a policeman, a police officer, and then all the way to now. I mean, it's so amazing. So
Yeah,
congratulations.
thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And obviously you were saying there about you've built up a big portfolio of property, a property portfolio when you were a letting agent. It would be really nice to hear, what did you learn from that as a letting agent?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. I think what I learned, the most important thing was don't take it personally. You are literally dealing with somebody else's asset. So if somebody's screaming down the phone at you, or if something's gone wrong, if you've just had a really bad day, don't take it personally and don't take it home. I was one of those letting agents that was still working at 12 o'clock at night if a tenant had rung or sent a text message. I was working all through weekends. I didn't take holidays. If I learned anything from being a letting agent, it's learn to set the level of expectation both for yourself and for your client, and don't take it home.
Mm, that's some really good advice there as well, actually. And if you don't mind me asking, why did you decide to sell up some of your property portfolio?
Again, I think it was just more of an organic situation, really. I
Yeah.
started my letting agency um, purely because I'd left my job as head of property management for a large asset and property management company in the city because I was going to care for my mum who was terminally ill. So then when my mum passed away, I was like, what am I going to do? I don't know if I want to go back to London, although I regret that now. I miss London. So I was like, what am I going to do? So I started a letting agency where I was living at the time when where mum was. And it just again kind of grew from there. And then I got to a point where I was like, yeah, this isn't fun anymore. I wasn't
Mm.
enjoying it. It was a task. And I was like, this is a time to give it up. So I sold the portfolio to another local letting agent, but retained the company name because I liked it. And yeah, just kind of went on to my next path.
That's really great to hear how you went on to your like next path and everything. I'm sorry to hear about your mum as well. And I guess with the letting agency as well, as you were saying before, it's very, very time consuming and you do need, I think everyone needs a bit of me time, right? So especially as a letting
Absolutely.
agent, because you're doing all this work, I feel like you probably don't get much downtime.
No, exactly. You don't. I mean, I run a networking group as well when we had our
Mm.
event last night, and there was a couple of property managers there last night, and I spotted them out the corner of my eye on their phones doing emails. I'm like, girls, no, it's we're finished. Have a drink. It's fine.
Exactly, a bit of me time now. Exactly. And then as well, I wanted to ask you as well, as I did an interview previously with Angharad Truman, who's the Arla Property Mark president, and we were talking about women in the property sector. And I'd just like to ask you, because when I was talking to her, she said some really interesting topics. As she was saying that it's not really a problem for women getting into the industry, it's about them progressing through the industry and into these leadership roles. So I'd like to hear from yourself as a woman in property what you think of that and how have you found it hard to be a woman in property sometimes or
Yeah, 100%. It's a male-dominated industry. It is.
Mhm.
There's no getting away from that. That's neither bad nor good. It is what it is. And we either have to adapt and work with it, or, we can throw our toys out the pram and get upset about it. I've certainly had my struggles. And I tend to find that the struggle comes more from the older male who maybe thinks that we have our place and we shouldn't be progressing. That's not for women. You just sit there and do your little job over there. That's lovely. So I've certainly had my struggles. And I think only recently, really, probably in the last couple of years, I've really felt that I've got to a point where I have genuinely been accepted by my male peers of the same level as me in the industry. Um, but again, I think it's one of those things that as women we just take in our stride daily. We are always in a position where we are thought of in society as slightly more inferior, so we just have to work with that. I don't know if there's ever going to get to a point where we can break that barrier down, but I think definitely we have to understand it, accept it, and work with it. I mean, it just means we have to work 10 times harder because we have to prove ourselves. Whereas a lot of men in the industry don't have that challenge. They can almost wing it. I mean, I was interviewing somebody for a letting agency the other day, and it was really interesting to watch the other interviewers with me. And the men were coming into the interview and were sitting there going, yeah, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, with loads of confidence, which was great to see. Whereas looking at their CV, I'm like, yeah, but you've never actually done it. So you're saying that you can do it, you've never actually done it. But then the women were coming in and they were saying, I have done that. And you could almost feel like they had to prove they could do it rather than just say, yeah, I could probably wing it, it's fine. So even there, the confidence is very different when you're looking at employing male and female staff. I find we tend to want to prove we absolutely can do it, whereas men are more confident saying, yeah, I probably could do it, but I'll Google it once I get the job and then I'll work it out from there. So I think as women, we have to prove ourselves. But it's certainly achievable. I mean, look at some of the fantastic women in the industry, Helen Chorley, for example, Hayley Andrews. It's absolutely possible, and you've just got to work at it.
Exactly. That's some really good advice for any young women watching is just to work at it. And I think there definitely has been some change in the industry, which is really good, as you were saying there with Helen Chorley, and I know with the Property Investors Awards as well. When I interviewed Emma Fielding, who won Young Property Investor of the Year, who's a young woman in property, which is really, really great. So I think that's really good. If we could move on to the private rented sector now, as we know, there's a lot going on and a lot to unpack. And a lot of landlords we hear in the media, and we've also heard on the Property 118 website as well, a lot of landlords are worried about the Labour government, the proposed renters' rights bill, and you hear some landlords saying, "Oh, I want to sell up, I'm fed up." And you sometimes hear from the media about this mass landlord exodus. I mean, from your expertise, are you seeing more landlords selling up now? Are you seeing this mass landlord exodus, or?
No, I'm really not. And I think the media are creating a lot of this because I think maybe it's a very slow news week or month. Um, I did a talk a little while ago, specifically for landlords, and one of the questions I asked was exactly that. How many people are looking to sell in 2024? How many people are looking to add to their portfolio in 2024? And everybody was looking to add to their portfolio in 2024. Nobody was looking to sell. And I was in a room full of individual landlords, not big portfolio landlords or corporates. These were individual landlords with one or two properties, the ones the media are talking about, and they're not looking to sell. Now, that doesn't mean that landlords out there aren't looking to sell. I'm quite sure there are some people that have just decided this is all getting a bit too much and maybe was going to sell in 5 years' time anyway, but have just brought it forward. But I'm certainly not seeing the mass exodus that the media is certainly portraying.
That's really interesting to hear, actually, as you were saying there, that group of sort of small portfolio landlords rather than the big portfolio landlords, because I suppose you're hearing from what you were saying from the media that these small portfolio landlords are exiting the sector. Do you think that maybe more older landlords are selling up and more young investors are coming into the industry as well?
Yeah, 100%. And again, I see that the coal face when I'm running my networking events, when I'm speaking to clients, and also when I'm speaking to other industry experts, so mortgage brokers and people like that. They're seeing a much of an increase in take up of buy-to-let mortgages as a person's first mortgage between the 25 to 35-year-old. So there are more people entering the sector with their first time property as a landlord rather than their home ownership. So I think that's really important to understand. But I also think the market is probably made for the younger audience now. And the reason why I say that is because everything is so fast moving and changes so quickly. I think if you're a more mature landlord who's maybe had your property for the last 20 years and you've been doing it the way you've been doing it, all of these changes it's just mind blowing. But for somebody coming into the industry as it is now, it's just as it is because you're picking it up straight away as it is now, as you're seeing it. Nothing's changing for you. So you're using all of the apps, you're using all of the online systems, the systemizing, all of this. So it's actually much easier to be a landlord coming in now than it's a landlord trying to adapt from somebody who's been doing it on pen and paper for the last 20 years.
Exactly, and that's good to hear about young investors coming into the sector. That's really, really good. And a lot of landlords we still have a lot of landlords that are worried about the Labour government and the proposed renters' rights bill. We still don't know what's quite happening with that, as it's all just legislation at the moment. But what would you like to see from the Labour government to actually help the private rented sector?
I'd like to see common sense for once. Um, I think the Renters' Rights Bill isn't going to be too different from the Renters' Reform Bill that we saw move through Parliament for the last 5 years. I think there'll be some tweaks. The thing that frustrates me about these new legislations that keep being brought in is they don't actually resolve the problem they're trying to solve. They just put a sticking plaster on an arterial bleed, so it really doesn't solve problems. We're still in a sector where we're working in 2024 with legislation from the 1700s. So it's no longer fit for purpose for society as it is today. So, for example, if a tenant hands in their notice and then doesn't leave, the landlord is entitled to claim double rent on a daily basis, but we rely on the Distress for Rent Act of 1737. So it doesn't make sense where we are today because obviously anything written in that act was based on life as it was in the 1700s, not how it is today in 2024. So I would like to see more of a deregulation than an addition to regulation. I'd like to see all of those antiquated laws got rid of and brought up to date in a new piece of legislation. So we're not referring to 169 acts and 402 regulations. We've got 3 or 4 in front of us, and that's what we're working from. But ultimately, what I'd really like to see is the enforcement of the legislation that we've already got. The government continue to say, we're bringing this new law, the councils are going to enforce it, we're going to get rid of all these rogue landlords. And then in the other side of the house, they're saying we're going to restrict all the funding to the local councils so they can't actually do the enforcement that we want them to do because we're taking all their money away. So I'd like to see more common sense. So I'd like to see more enforcement of the legislation rather than just more legislation.
That's some very, very, very good advice there. We do need more common sense. So I wonder if any MPs are watching that are listening. We do need some common sense in the private rented sector. And you were talking about there all the rules and regulations that, oh, there's just hundreds to actually follow and understand. And one topic that I'm seeing coming up again and again, and I know you've done an article on the Property 118 website about this, is about e-bikes. And when you actually see the videos of these e-bikes when they're charging them, and then you see these explosions of fires, they're really, really scary, and they're just a massive fireball, and obviously destroys the property, and oh, it's just awful. So what can landlords do to mitigate these risks of e-bike fires?
Really and truthfully, it's communication. It's about setting that level of expectation before the tenant moves in, having clear clauses in your tenancy agreements that bans them, or if you are a landlord who's able to have a designated area for charging, making sure that's really clear to the tenant. But also, again, understanding the law that is actually there to protect you. Because a lot of the time, if a tenant is charging an e-bike in a property, then there is an insurance issue there. If the e-bike goes pop, they don't that you can't put out the batteries. They have to thermally run on until they've run out of steam. Even the fire brigade can't put them out. There's no way of actually extinguishing them. So what you have to do is say to a tenant, if I come along and find an e-bike being charged in the property, I have the legal right to confiscate that item. And a lot of landlords don't realise that. So they can do that under the Interference with Goods Act. So that's tort Interference with Goods Act of 1977. They do actually have the legal right to remove that e-bike, but they have to store it safely. So they can't just like leave it on the side of the road. They have to look after it. So that's a consequence for the tenant that can be enforced. But ultimately, I think landlords are going to have to adapt because more and more people have e-bikes and e-scooters and obviously electric cars. They're going to be charging them at the property. So I think landlords have to adapt to how they're going to manage that. But also, I suppose, more fire precautions, maybe specifically saying to the tenant they can only charge items that have been bought from reputable suppliers. So not buying a battery off the internet because you genuinely don't know how good that is. I was dealing with a landlord a couple of weeks ago who it wasn't even an e-bike, it was actually the battery out of a disposable vape. And the tenant had been doing exactly the right thing. She'd been putting it into the recycling bin outside. With the hot weather we've just had, a couple of those exploded in the bin, side of the house went up. So, it's in our daily lives that we don't even think about, even phone chargers. The batteries in our mobile phones can spontaneously combust under our pillows at night. We've seen that in the media. So I think it's just about managing that. It's managing the tenant's expectations and the communication on the consequences, because a lot of the time it's education. People just don't know. So I think landlords now have to manage that by educating the tenants and regular inspections to make sure that those e-bikes are being charged correctly or not there at all if that's the terms of the tenancy.
Thank you for that advice there, because that's really, really helpful. And as you were saying there as well, I just guess we just don't even think about it in our daily lives, do we? I mean, I go and charge my phone every morning, and you just don't think about whether it could spontaneously combust. It's just something that I think a topic that we keep seeing crop up again and again, and I'm sure in the future as well. And one other topic that I'm seeing coming up, again, and again, you've written about this on the Property 118 website, is about what should landlords do when they're renting to a charity, for example. So, what protections and knowledge do landlords need for renting to a charity?
Yeah, I think, like you say, this is something that crops up time and time
Mm.
again. It's basically it's the rent to rent model as we know it. So, as a landlord, you would rent your property to a charity. They would then sublet it on to either someone who's homeless or asylum seekers or people coming out of prison, anybody of those vulnerable categories. The problem landlords are finding is a lot of the time that they don't have the right contracts in place. So we have to start with the property itself. Now, there's lots of things that can go wrong there. If you're renting your property directly to somebody who's going to live in it as their main and principal home, there's very few things you have to consider. But the most important thing when you're dealing with rent to rent is, first of all, does your mortgage product allow you to sublet in this way? Most of them don't. They have to be a specialist mortgage product. The other one is if the property is a flat or has a lease on it rather than a freehold, are there any covenants in that lease that would restrict the renting in this way? Most of them don't stop you renting on an assured short hold tenancy because it's going to be someone's main home. But again, charities aren't going to use it in that way. They're not living in it, they're using it for a different purpose. They're using it for business. So again, it's understanding that here you're actually having a commercial relationship rather than a residential relationship. And again, the contracts. I see so many people signing assured short hold tenancies with the charities. It's not the right contract. Legally, it's not the right contract. You cannot sign an AST with someone who's not living in the property and isn't an individual, so a human being. You can't sign it with an entity. So it has to be the right contract with a lease management agreement contract. These things are much more complex. They are usually fully repairing on the charity, so that's important to understand. A lot of landlords still think they're responsible for the property, the gas certificates, and all of that. They're not. They hand all of that over to the rent to rent operator or the charity, who then, in the eyes of the law, become the immediate landlord. So they take on all those responsibilities. I would also want to see rent guarantee insurance, because a lot of the time, if the charities aren't getting the money in, how are they going to guarantee that rent to the landlord? Um, and just making sure that the charity is actually using the property for what they said they were going to use it for. And I would do background checks on the charity. How long has it been running? If it's just recently been set up, I may be more wary, because it's much easier to close a charity down if it hasn't been running very long. It's also much easier for it to go wrong. But if you've got a charity that's well established and it's been doing this for some time, then you're probably safer as a landlord with passing your property over to them. Now, all of that said, I think it's extremely important that landlords, if they can, do provide their properties to these charities, because otherwise these human beings are going to be on the street and they're going to be the council's problem, and the circle starts again. So absolutely, if landlords can send their properties to charities in this way, I think that's a great way for landlords to have hands off. They're not involved. They've got this rent coming in every month. They don't have to worry about voids or maintenance or anything like that. So it's a fantastic way of managing your property. I just think landlords just have to put a little bit more time in at the beginning, just to make sure it's the right decision.
Exactly. I think it's about that thorough research, as you were saying, as you need to check out the charity, as you were saying, just to make sure. And if it's new, sort of be a little bit more wary, but some really, really good advice there. And another thing that we see a lot on the Property 118 website, we get a lot of readers' questions come in talking about rent increases and how landlords can increase the rent while also keeping the tenants happy. And it's a little bit of a balancing act, isn't it? Just to try and keep the tenants happy. So, what advice do you have for landlords on that?
Again, it comes back to communication completely. I think what landlords and letting agents sometimes fail to understand is, when a tenant rents a property, they never rent at the lower end of their budget. They always rent at the top end of their budget. So they're already stretched. They're already giving as much of their income as they know they can possibly afford on a property. So to increase rent by £200-300 a month, that's usually not possible for most tenants, because they don't have that additional income. It's not spare. So I would be communicating with tenants. I would be explaining from the moment they move in, there will be an annual rent increase. And I say this all the time, the importance of doing a rent increase every year. A lot of landlords, and I get it, it's out of the kindness of their heart. They want to keep the rent as low as possible for as long as possible. That's actually not good business sense for either the landlord or the tenant. Because as a landlord, your outgoings are going to be going up. You're going to have to chase that with the rent. But also for the tenant, they get comfortable in that lower rent. So then they start to budget around that lower rent. And then suddenly, when they do get a rent increase, it's completely unaffordable and unrealistic. Then you start getting the angry phone calls and the text messages, and the relationship breaks down. But also, if they then want to move on, they're seeing all these much higher rents. Whereas if you were increasing the rent regularly every year, yes, you can still keep it low, but it's much more in keeping with the market rates that are out there and much more manageable for people. But again, it's all communication, because the first thing we do as landlords and letting agents is check someone's affordability before they move in. Yet we never check their affordability before we put rent up.
Mm. Exactly. And as you were saying, I think it all comes back down to communication, which is really, really important. And finally, I know it's a really big question to ask, but what do you think of the future of the private rented sector? Do you see a bright future?
I do see a bright future, actually. I think realistically, the private sector is going to be needed, and it's going to be needed more and more and more. There isn't enough social housing, we know that. And despite Labour, their manifesto of building 1.5 million homes, I can't see that coming to fruition. I can't see that working. So the private sector is always going to be needed. It's going to be a case of maybe we see a younger audience of landlords coming in, who maybe manage it completely different to how we've been doing for the last 30 years. And that's not a bad thing. Change is absolutely great. I'm seeing much more AI coming into the industry now, with especially with larger letting agents maybe having chat bots and things like that, giving help and advice to tenants. Even reporting maintenance is all now done on an app. So I'm seeing much more of that. But I think for the private rented sector, it's always going to be needed. And I don't think that anytime soon we're going to see that deteriorating. There's how many millions of people in the private rented sector. If you got rid of that tomorrow, where on earth are they going to go?
Exactly as you were saying, if it all breaks down, then where are all these tenants going to go? It's just so, so needed. But thank you so much, Julie, for coming on today. It was really, really good to get all your advice. We talked a lot there about the private rented sector. So I hope that anyone watching, it's all helpful advice to them. So thank you for coming on again, Julie. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much for having me.